What's going on, guys? So in today's video, we'll be exposing the 2016-17 NBA voters whose ballots were made public by the NBA on June 26, 2017. And to start, we'll be looking at what was perhaps the most controversial ballot that season, which came from Steve Kyler of Basketball Insiders, who kept Draymond Green of the Golden State Warriors completely off of his Defensive Player of the Year ballot by having Kawhi Leonard, Rudy Gobert, and Hassan Whiteside as his top 3 choices. Now, as a side note, please keep in mind that Draymond Green was left off of only 2 Defensive Player of the Year ballots that season, one being Steve Kyler and the other being Marcelo Nogueira, which we'll see later on in the video. But in the case of Steve Kyler, when he was then questioned on Twitter about his ballot as it relates to Draymond Green, his response was that he saw his vote as an opportunity to start a conversation around whether or not such an award should be given to someone like Draymond Green, who had been blatantly questionable. And when talking about Draymond Green's questionable play, Steve Kyler referenced 2 incidents: the infamous Steven Adams kick and the one-time Draymond Green punched James Harden on his wrist during a regular season game. Now, the first point to make in regards to these 2 incidents is that the Steven Adams kick took place during the 2016 NBA playoffs and had nothing to do with Draymond Green's defensive play during the 2016-17 regular season. And as for the James Harden incident, had Steve Kyler done a bit more research, he would have seen that James Harden had been pinching Draymond Green throughout the game, which is why Draymond Green instinctively punched James Harden to try and get him to stop.
Clip, kind of mid-game clip floating around online about, you were jostling with Harden and slapped down on the wrist. What was just happening there?
He pinched me, so I punched his wrist. That's pretty much it. So yeah, like here. So he does it often, actually, which is kind of adolescent, but whatever.
Is that common around the league, or is it
no,
just like
guys aren't going around pinching people. But that's what happened, so yeah.
But what was perhaps the most incriminating piece of evidence against Steve Kyler is that he admitted per his Twitter that had the Defensive Player of the Year voting been close, he would have indeed voted for Draymond Green. The only reason why he didn't is because he had spoken to enough media members to know that his vote wouldn't affect the outcome, which is why he then used his vote as a talking point to quote-unquote start a conversation. Now, please keep in mind that while Steve Kyler's moral compass doesn't allow him to give Draymond Green a Defensive Player of the Year vote, it does, however, allow him to give Draymond Green an all-defensive first-team vote. What must also be mentioned is that when Steve Kyler was questioned about whether or not he had ever voted for Chris Paul, given his questionable play over the years, his answer, as it relates to the NBA awards, was no. Which is somewhat deceiving, since 2017 was Steve Kyler's first and only year as an official voter. However, he did have Chris Paul on his All-NBA third team and All-Defensive first team that season. Next, we have Eddie Sefko of the Dallas Morning News, who was exposed for his Dallas Mavericks bias in our 2017-18 video, and his 2016-17 ballot was no different, as it featured Yogi Ferrell of the Dallas Mavericks third on his Rookie of the Year ballot, which was Yogi Ferrell's only Rookie of the Year vote, ahead of Joel Embiid of the Philadelphia 76ers and Buddy Hield of the Sacramento Kings. Then there's Harrison Barnes of the Dallas Mavericks, who is third on Eddie Sefko's Most Improved Player of the Year ballot, while his teammate Wesley Matthews ended up on Eddie Sefko's All-Defensive first team. So now that we've seen some of the more controversial voters, let's now look at the All-Defensive team, starting with Rudy Gobert, Kawhi Leonard, and Draymond Green, who each fell just 1 vote short of being unanimously selected to the All-Defensive team that season. In Rudy Gobert's case, it was Lisa Shenyang of Tencent who kept Rudy Gobert completely off of her ballot and instead chose Dwight Howard of the Atlanta Hawks and Hassan Whiteside of the Miami Heat as her all-defensive team centers. Lisa Shenyang was also the one voter that season who had Eric Gordon of the Houston Rockets on an all-defensive team, where she penciled him in as her all-defensive first-team guard. Then there's Richard Walker of the Gaston Gazette, who was the only voter that chose to exclude Kawhi Leonard from his all-defensive team ballot, only to give one of his votes to Karl Anthony Towns of the Minnesota Timberwolves, whose one and only vote came from Richard Walker. But what was most surprising about his all-defensive ballot is that it also featured Russell Westbrook of the Oklahoma City Thunder, Damian Lillard of the Portland Trail Blazers, and Nicolas Batum of the Charlotte Hornets. Next is Marcelo Nogueira of Olé, who was the one voter that kept Draymond Green from being unanimously selected to the all-defensive team, and instead chose his teammate and backup Andre Iguodala, as well as LaMarcus Aldridge of the San Antonio Spurs. Marcelo Nogueira also had Isaiah Thomas of the Boston Celtics on his all-defensive second team, which was Isaiah Thomas's one and only all-defensive vote, and in doing so, chose him ahead of his teammates Avery Bradley and Marcus Smart. Now, other questionable all-defensive ballots that season include Mark Berman of the New York Post, who had LeBron James of the Cleveland Cavaliers on his all-defensive first team ahead of Kawhi Leonard, Anthony Davis, Andre Roberson, and Kevin Durant. Meanwhile, Bill Simmons of The Ringer chose to exclude Chris Paul from his all-defensive ballot that season, only to have his teammate and backup Austin Rivers on his all-defensive second team, which was his one and only all-defensive vote that season. Stephen Curry of the Golden State Warriors, on the other hand, managed to receive 3 all-defensive second-team votes from David Aldridge of TNT, Steve Kyler of Basketball Insiders, and Marcelo Nogueira of Olé. Then there's Russell Westbrook of the Oklahoma City Thunder, who received 5 all-defensive votes that season, all of them being for the first team, from Reggie Miller, Matt Weiner, and David Aldridge of TNT, as well as Richard Walker of the Gaston Gazette and Steve Kyler of Basketball Insiders. However, for many of these voters, the inconsistency on their ballots can better be observed when their all-defensive selections are put alongside their Defensive Player of the Year ballots. Like Richard Walker of the Gaston Gazette, who had Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz second on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first among centers, but then chose to put Rudy Gobert on his all-defensive second team behind Hassan Whiteside of the Miami Heat. Which doesn't make sense, especially when that's juxtaposed to a consistent ballot, like that of ESPN's Calvin Watkins, who also had Rudy Gobert second on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first among centers, but unlike Richard Walker, had the presence of mind to put Rudy Gobert on his all-defensive first team as a center. And while most of the voters that season were consistent with their ballots in that regard, a few weren't. This includes Lisa Shanyang of Tencent, who had Rudy Gobert third on her Defensive Player of the Year ballot, first among centers, but then chose to keep him completely off of her all-defensive first and second team ballot. Meanwhile, Andrew Sharp of Sports Illustrated had Andre Roberson of the Oklahoma City Thunder third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Draymond Green amongst forwards, but then chose to put Andre Roberson on his all-defensive second team behind Kawhi Leonard of the San Antonio Spurs. Then there's Marcelo Nogueira of Olé, who had LaMarcus Aldridge of the San Antonio Spurs third on his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, second to only Kawhi Leonard amongst forwards, but then chose to put LaMarcus Aldridge on his all-defensive second team behind Draymond Green of the Golden State Warriors. And last but not least is Mark Berman of the New York Post, who was the only voter that season that kept Rudy Gobert of the Utah Jazz completely off of his Defensive Player of the Year ballot, and instead chose to give LeBron James of the Cleveland Cavaliers his one and only Defensive Player of the Year vote. Now, as for the NBA's Sixth Man of the Year voting, the only questionable ballot that season revolved around Tyler Johnson of the Miami Heat, who got his one and only Sixth Man of the Year vote from Manny Navarro, who was covering the Heat for the Miami Herald at that time. Then there's the NBA's Rookie of the Year voting, where ESPN's very own Doris Burke gave Buddy Hield of the Sacramento Kings a third-place Rookie of the Year vote, but then chose to keep him completely off of her all-rookie first and second team ballot. Meanwhile, J. Michael Falgust of CSN Washington was the only voter that season who gave Rodney Magruder of the Miami Heat a third-place Rookie of the Year vote despite his below-average statistics. Next is the NBA's Most Improved Player of the Year voting, where Ryan Wolstadt gave DeMar DeRozan of the Toronto Raptors his one and only Most Improved Player of the Year vote, which isn't surprising considering the fact that Ryan Wolstadt covers the Raptors for the Toronto Sun. Meanwhile, Mike Conley of the Memphis Grizzlies received his one and only Most Improved Player of the Year vote from Ron Tillery, who covered the Grizzlies as a beat writer for the Memphis Commercial Appeal. Then there's Bradley Beal of the Washington Wizards, whose one and only first-place Most Improved Player of the Year vote came from J. Michael Falgust, who was covering the Wizards for CSN Washington at that time. Now, the next set of ballots that we'll be looking at are from the All-NBA teams, where Kevin Durant in his first season with the Golden State Warriors played at a superstar level and was thus rewarded with an All-NBA second-team selection. However, being that Kevin Durant was left completely off of 5 media ballots, which can only be attributed to him missing the last 20 games of the season due to injury, the question to then ask is, are these 5 voters being consistent with their ballot? Because Sean Devaney of the Sporting News, who was one of those 5 voters, had Kawhi Leonard and LeBron James on his All-NBA ballot in 2019, even though they played in just 60 and 55 games respectively. Sean Devaney also had Stephen Curry, Joel Embiid, Kyrie Irving, Rudy Gobert, and Jimmy Butler on his All-NBA ballot in 2018, even though they played in only 51, 63, 60, 56, and 59 games respectively that season. Then in 2016, Sean Devaney had Anthony Davis of the New Orleans Pelicans on his All-NBA second team, even though Anthony Davis had played in just 61 games that season. And in 2014, Sean Devaney chose to put Chris Paul on his All-NBA first team after he played in just 62 games that season. Then we have Chris Webber of TNT and Michael Grange of Rogers Sportsnet, who had also chosen to keep Kevin Durant completely off of their All-NBA ballot in 2017. But in the case of Chris Webber, he had voted for Joel Embiid of the Philadelphia 76ers on his All-NBA second team in 2018, even though he had played in just 63 games that season, while Michael Grange had Kawhi Leonard of the Toronto Raptors on his All-NBA second team in 2019, even though he played in only 60 games that season. Next is Richard Walker of the Gaston Gazette, who also had Kawhi Leonard on his All-NBA second team in 2019, and then had Stephen Curry, Kyrie Irving, and Rudy Gobert on his All-NBA ballot in 2018, even though they played in just 51, 60, and 56 games respectively that season. And last but not least is J. Michael Falgust of CSN Washington, who was the 5th voter that chose to keep Kevin Durant off of his All-NBA ballot in 2017, but then penciled in Avery Bradley of the Boston Celtics on his All-Defensive second team, even though he played in just 55 games that season. However, for many of these All-NBA voters, the inconsistency on their ballots can better be observed when their MVP votes are put alongside their All-NBA selections. Like Aileen Voisin of the Sacramento Bee and Rick Bucher of Bleacher Report, who both had Kawhi Leonard third on their MVP ballot that season, first amongst forwards, but then chose to put Kawhi Leonard on their All-NBA second team behind LeBron James and Kevin Durant. Which doesn't make sense, especially when that's juxtaposed to a consistent ballot, like that of ESPN analyst Jalen Rose, who also had Kawhi Leonard third on his MVP ballot, first amongst forwards, but unlike Aileen Voisin and Rick Bucher, had the presence of mind to put Kawhi Leonard on his All-NBA first team. Now, Michael Grange of Rogers Sportsnet was another voter that had Kawhi Leonard third on his MVP ballot, first amongst forwards, but then put Kawhi Leonard on his All-NBA second team behind LeBron James and Anthony Davis. Meanwhile, Richard Walker of the Gaston Gazette had Kawhi Leonard 5th on his MVP ballot, first amongst forwards, but then chose to put Kawhi Leonard on his All-NBA third team behind LeBron James, Anthony Davis, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Karl Anthony Towns. Next is Flavio Tranquillo of Sky Italia, who had Russell Westbrook third on his MVP ballot, second to only James Harden amongst guards, but then chose to put Russell Westbrook on his All-NBA second team behind Stephen Curry of the Golden State Warriors. Meanwhile, Sherrod Blakely of CSN New England had LeBron James fifth on his MVP ballot, second to only Kawhi Leonard amongst forwards, but then chose to put LeBron James on his All-NBA second team behind Kevin Durant of the Golden State Warriors. Then we have Doug Collins of ABC and Eddie Sefko of the Dallas Morning News, who had Isaiah Thomas of the Boston Celtics fifth on their MVP ballot, third to only James Harden and Russell Westbrook amongst guards, but then put Isaiah Thomas on their All-NBA third team behind Stephen Curry of the Golden State Warriors and John Wall of the Washington Wizards. Joe Vardon of Cleveland.com also had Isaiah Thomas of the Boston Celtics fifth on his MVP ballot, third to only James Harden and Russell Westbrook amongst guards, but then put Isaiah Thomas on his All-NBA third team behind Stephen Curry of the Golden State Warriors and Kyrie Irving of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Then there's Kurt Heelan of NBCSports.com, who had Isaiah Thomas fifth on his MVP ballot, third to only James Harden and Russell Westbrook amongst guards, but then put Isaiah Thomas on his All-NBA third team behind Stephen Curry of the Golden State Warriors and Chris Paul of the Los Angeles Clippers. And last but not least is Steve Kyler of Basketball Insiders, who had Isaiah Thomas fifth on his MVP ballot, third to only James Harden and Russell Westbrook amongst guards, but then chose to keep Isaiah Thomas completely off of his All-NBA second and third team ballot. Now, while all of the voters that we've covered are certainly entitled to their own opinions, what we've seen from these 2016-17 NBA ballots is that many of them just aren't consistent in how they vote, while others have made a complete mockery of the voting process.